All right, welcome for this Canadian Patriot special report. It's a bit of an emergency broadcast, and a little while ago, Anton and I did something just like what we're about to do now in regards to the world strategic situation, and it got a very good response. Anton is somebody who's got his fingers on the pulse of the geopolitical terrain with a very highly informed sense of historical dynamics that is really unparalleled in my experience. And a lot of Anton's works have been published on the Canadian Patriot review site. On the For decades, he was a leading historian for Executive Intelligence Review. His works are all available, including his new books, online that people can purchase or find in some cases for free. So I highly recommend people check that stuff out and go in the description box to Anton's website. His new volume, Who We Are, America's for the Fight for Progress and America's True Identity, Volume 2 is I think on the verge of coming out. Volume 1 is already out, so people should pick those up. Go to the description box, like I said. But for today's purposes, we are now November 4th, going into a very important moment in history that won't be resolved on November 5th or 6th, which is the U.S. elections. And Anton, you sent something out on your Substack this morning that I thought was very potent, very sharp insight in that referenced the dynamics surrounding John F. Kennedy. And I'd like us to go through a little bit of that, and then I'd like to ask you a few questions pertaining to this very short, concise warning that you put out. Are you okay if I just do a little screen share right now, Anton?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'd like to just do the share in order to show what this short little write-up was that you sent out. And I'm going to read a little bit of that, maybe the whole thing. And it literally reads, oh, hold on.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it here. So you titled this, "Can the Bay of Pigs Men Force the Hand of the Next President?" You wrote here, referring to 1960, and you're drawing certain parallels. You say back in 1960, the pro-imperial faction within the U.S. government looked forward nervously to the November election that would bring in a new president. Would candidate John Kennedy defeat candidate Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president? Might Kennedy interfere with the Anglo-American power structure that used the CIA and the Pentagon for imperial interests rather than American interests? The transatlantic men were taking no chances. Allen Dulles at CIA and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer organized an operation that would force the incoming president to run a war against Cuba to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. An invasion by covertly trained Cuban exiles was to occur just after the presidential inauguration. Kennedy won the election and allowed the plan to go ahead. When he saw that the invasion at Cuba's Bay of Pigs was a fiasco and a trap, he aborted it. Kennedy subsequently removed Dulles and Lyman Lemnitzer from their posts. And then there's just 3 paragraphs left, so I'll just read and then we'll talk about this. Today, the heirs of Dulles and Lemnitzer fear that the next president might interfere against their globalism and forever wars. They have set in motion spiraling escalation that might light a fire the next president cannot put out. With screaming war hype, U.S. weapons are flying toward potentially uncontrollable conflagrations: Israel versus Iran, Lebanon, Palestine, NATO, EU versus Russia, North Korea, U.S. versus China. Realists acknowledge that the present Anglo-American regime is more than the U.S. governmental structure. Unless they send the human race off a nuclear war cliff, that regime will linger in power no matter who becomes president, until it is taken down. Until the president, backed by the people, finishes what John Kennedy started when he began taking down the usurping apparatus in intelligence and the military. The coming weeks of tumult are not only dangerous, we are also offered a rare chance for civilization to move forward by restoring power over U.S. affairs to those committed to U.S. national interests and thus to the interests of humanity. Very well said, Anton. And I guess my first question here is, what is it specifically that JFK was doing? Who was he challenging? And how do you see these parallels in greater detail unfolding today?
Well, first of all, I think that there's a principle of foreign and domestic that has to be understood to get any of this and to see where we really are. And this is where people many people in America are acting as fools. And that is that sometimes people think, well, these folks in power or in the presidency or in the Congress have a bad foreign policy. They go along with, bad things, but at least they're going to keep Roosevelt's, the Democrats, for example, will keep Roosevelt's advances. They'll keep Social Security. The Republicans want to cut it. And it's true about a lot of Republicans want to do nasty things. They're right wingers. They're hoodlums in many ways. But this whole idea of separating the foreign policy from domestic is a piece of betrayal and insanity. First of all, what is the foreign policy of the United States at the present time? It's mass murder on a scale that's almost incomprehensible, and beckons to be the whole human race. So, do mass murderers do good things with their own population? Well, aside from any behavioral characteristics of mass murderers, the basic idea here is that there's a system in place, and the people who are the Jake Sullivans of the world, the advisors, the ones that are running policy, they are protecting a system. That's the way they think about it. So the system is defined by a philosophy that has no public interest to it. The public interest, the interest of the United States as a nation, the interest of humanity is completely absent from this system. This is the imperial system.
Mm-hmm.
The worst imperial system that ever existed. It's the late 19th century British Empire, defined as, kill, slaughter, lie, Satanism. To me, that's the system that we've gotten to. And you see this with all of the wars going on and with the lies and the censorship. I don't think there's ever been in modern history anything, perhaps, the worst years of Hitler compared to this. So this divide between foreign and domestic is doubly insane when people come up with this. And this is the way people are thinking now. Friends of mine have said this to me. You can't allow this regime to go down, because if the other side takes over, then they'll kill off some of the advances that we've made in the economy or something like that. Completely wrong, totally wrong. The world isn't that way. No matter what partial facts you're raising about what the Republican Party stands for, which is bad. But that's not the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So leave it at that.
It seems like there has been a breaking away from the typical neocon apparatus that's taken control of the Republican Party over so many decades, in the form of a certain patriot, nonpartisan momentum, which we've seen Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democrat,
I agree.
Bobby
That's
Kennedy,
right.
a former Democrat, supporting the figure of Trump, while at the same time many hard war hawks like Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, a lot of the worst elements of what ran the forever wars from the Republican side of things have endorsed Kamala Harris. So you're seeing, I think, what a convergence of the worst of the contamination of both parties converge into sort of one behemoth, at the same time as you have the better patriotic traditions also inversely converging and working together at the same time, ironically. So it's not really about partisan politics anymore, the way that many media outlets try to frame it. So what do you see as the greatest threats to this system that's latched on going into the current elections? What types of policies do you see being possibly positively disruptive to that very system? And what are those parallels to what JFK was doing that you think people should think about?
Well, uh, Kennedy was focused all the time on both foreign and domestic policies, and of course, he had to pay closest attention to the gravest threats to the world peace involving possible nuclear war and other things that could spiral uncontrollably. But at the present time, it seems to me, and this is only I'm not an expert on so many things to do with policy making and in the way the world works, but it seems to me that if a peaceful resolution could be even aimed at and publicly spoken of in a sober way by U.S. leadership. And of course, if a progress towards peace in the Middle East, with China, with Russia, on any of these fronts, then I think that the enemy, that is the war makers, which are the enemy of our country and of humanity, they would panic. They would be in a terrible and terrifying to them situation, because the public would see that peace is possible, and that a different mode of operating in the world is possible. This is a top-down way of looking at it. And everything that's wrong in the United States has a good deal to do with what the USA and its cohorts now, the British and Israelis and other people, but everything that's wrong in our country has to do with what we do abroad and what we've done abroad. So you hear some people say, well, so and so is violent, or we have a problem about violence. And here we have as a policy constant escalation of violence as a national policy.
Yeah.
Over here, but we condemn it over here. Imagine that the war comes to an end or begins to come to an end. Everything changes. In my view, everything else follows from that. And that's what you have to focus on, because there you have the whole world is concerned with that right now. Everybody in the world has that as an immediate concern. So that's where we have to focus, and that's what will change things. Peace.
And in your short write-up that you put out, which I think is a good compliment to inspire people to want to dig into your much bigger essay, which we published in 2017, and we just reran that again this week on the coup then and now, going through the deep battles of John F. Kennedy versus Allen Dulles, Lyman Lemnitzer, and others, in order to really inform people about what was the United States capable of doing when it had competent leadership that was tied to universal principles contained and expressed in the best of America's traditions and founding documents. So that's something that we're also going to include in the description box of this video. But can you give maybe some concrete examples of what types of strategy John F. Kennedy had on board? Because in my analysis, a lot of people I talk to who are good people, they've read a lot of slanderous accounts of Kennedy that portray Kennedy as as responsible for the Bay of Pigs, as another imperialist, anti-commie, McCarthyite type. There's so much stuff that has contaminated people's ability to appreciate what Kennedy was actually doing to tackle this monstrous systemic structure in so many ways. So maybe could you give like some concrete, quick examples of what Kennedy was doing? What sort of things could be done as far as a way of thinking that would be competent today, as far as 1960?
So, I mean, for this kind of issue, the persons who have been leftists all their lives uh, have to take a deep breath and say, maybe I can learn something different, or maybe there's another there's another plane of existence that we have to look at. So, throughout American history, uh, the national interest of the United States, the interest of the progress of the country, without which there is no prosperity. You can't have prosperity without the progress of physical industry. You can't have prosperity without a government dedicated to increasing the production of wealth and the share that goes to the working class. Both of those things at the same time. But that is the national interest of the United States. There is no other national interest. And so throughout our history, that national interest has clashed with the imperial system. It was clashing with it when the slave owners were part of that imperial system, and they were part politically and economically in terms of exports and imports in many different ways. I'm not going to get deeply into that history, but if you go to Kennedy, look at what he wanted to do with the steel industry. He wanted to have investment directed with the encouragement of the government. Private investment was to be directed at research and plant expansion in the steel industry to bring U.S. production in steel, to increase it and to put it on a more advanced level.
Mm-hmm.
And there were certain elements of the steel industry that favored that for their own interest and for the future of the country. But the majority of this faction that was controlling the steel and other industries from Wall Street, particularly the Morgan firm in New York, were opposed to the investment tax credit. That is, they did not want any special advantages that the government would provide that would increase the profit of the steelmakers by them increasing production or R&D, on the principle that the government has to be kept out of, and the aspirations of the people of the country have to be kept out of private investment, so that the private investment they were interested in is not focused as much on what people usually think of as profit. It was focused on the power of their faction internationally to control politics, the policies of nations, and absolute complete freedom to steal and loot and kill off whatever they wanted to internationally. This is the offshore banking system. This is the link between the bankers and the mafia and the drug cartels, things like that. So what you're talking about here is the clash between the national interest, which always has to have a government leadership involved. The government doesn't run industry, but they have to lead. And the national interest is in a direct clash with the imperial interest. And so when people say that the U.S. and Russians say this and Chinese say that, but they also say other things because they know things that just leftists don't, the Russians and the Chinese, for example. So, but when people say that the U.S. is only concerned about its own interests in doing so and so with NATO, that's ridiculous. No, the U.S. interest is in squashing imperialism, the direct national interest of the United States. And of course, is in stability. What stability do we want? Stability, we want the stability to carry on ordinary business and trade and production.
Yeah.
What does the enemy want? And of course, we want the security for a family to survive, to do well, to have a nice neighborhood, to have a good home, to have a good school, and have things go nicely from year to year without catastrophe. That's security. What does the enemy want? They don't want security. They want chaos. They want managed, controlled chaos.
Mhm.
And so the national interest of the United States and the imperial interest are the opposite interests in the world, period. That's the discussion. And it goes for every other country as well. Every country has a national interest. And the national interest of each country in a modern world are in tremendous harmony with the national interests of every other country. That's the basis for understanding economics in the modern world.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And in your assessments, when JFK, what made his maneuvers, because I know in your writings, in your expositions, you've proven very, very concretely the incredible efforts JFK had made, as far as opening up the door with his collaborators in the steel industry, Kaiser, against the Morgan interests of U.S. Steel, that were not just based upon creating domestic development of high tech, manufacturing and infrastructure, but also abroad, to Africa, to other nations that had been so exploited by imperialists. You made the very concrete point that JFK worked very hard to help other nations develop and stand on their own 2 feet, full spectrum economies, which was verboten. That type of the creation of economic opportunity, stability, a reliable, healthy optimism for the future, are really antagonistic and antithetical to the very system of empire which Allen Dulles and company represented. Um, Today, what would you say? And you pointed out concretely their efforts to sabotage JFK early on by getting the ball into motion even before JFK was president with the Bay of Pigs, that he couldn't fully resist early on when the president doesn't have too much influence in the early days. But he was able to then fire Dulles, put the brakes on, and carry out a battle. Today, you outlined that in some ways it's more dangerous because there's more spark plugs. And you outlined several of them in the Middle East, around China, NATO, EU versus Russia, and US. What do you think would be the sanest way for a president emerging into a position of power in the coming weeks and months ahead? And I say months even because I don't know if we're going to get a reliable outcome. I hope we do. I hope we do, but I don't think we will. For many weeks or maybe even months, there will be a lot of disputes. But all that to say, it's going to be chaotic. But if somebody's going to earn the trust of the people of America and the other nations of the world, what do you think that president should do based on JFK's precedents, in regards to China, Russia, other nominal enemies of the United States, or nations we're being told are enemies to be afraid of and to hate? What should they do differently than what's currently being done?
I think that there's a lot of precedents for this, that you do back channel communications with Iran, with Russia, with China. It doesn't have to be real back channel with Russia and China, but you do have to go around the palace guard of the neocons and the British. But you have a back channel, and also to Netanyahu and I would say to other people in Israel, or maybe old intelligence hands there. And you say, look, we're going to get something going. You want to be a part of that, and do try to develop a pathway towards standing down from the escalation. And then once you have something going, maybe that's quietly, then what's required is maybe the hardest thing of all, and that is for somebody like Trump, or maybe some other spokesman, but certainly it was likely Trump, to be able to make a sober presentation of what is has to change. What are our now new possibilities? What's hopeful? And try to keep the public informed. This is what FDR did that worked. You know, he had I don't know how many press conferences, but the whole idea is that you got to get public backing for what you're doing. And that means you have to get people who are able to be rational to back you up. And they have to be able to be calm and have hope.
Mm-hmm.
And so the mode of presentation has to reflect the change in the procedure that you're doing to get to open up these channels. And
Right.
every kind of president that had anything on the ball has always done that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Anton, thank you very much for sharing these insights going into this very historic moment and this battle. I mean, this is so important that we get people to think about the universal principles that are in play, shaping creating the context for the world that they think they're operating in. It's often overlooked, so very, very much appreciate you chiming in on this. Again, your two write-ups, the longer essay and the shorter punchy write-up, are both available in the description box of this video. I encourage people to read, study, reread, especially that longer essay, and then share widely this material with your entire networks. Very, very important stuff to really internalize. So I look forward to doing this again with you. I appreciate these emergency broadcasts, and I know a lot of people watching the Canadian Patriot and the Rising Tide Foundation also really appreciate these things too. So thank you, Anton, and thank you everyone for tuning in for this one. Take care.
Thanks for the opportunity, Matt. Wonderful.
Cheers.